So factors to be considered are whether a specific law or industry provision requires an employee to receive a certain vaccination or a vaccination for a certain reason. So that looks at whether or not there's been any mandates, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. Certain industries have been mandated. Whether the enterprise agreement or employment contract contains vaccination provisions. So in some daycare centres, for instance, prior to COVID, there was a requirement that they must have flu shots and things like that beforehand. So that was already part of their contracts. Whether a vaccination direction is discriminatory, so whether or not it does have any grounds for discriminatory action, if it's directed at someone in particular, we'll look at that also later. The nature of the specific place of employment and role of the employee, including the degree of risk to others of not vaccinating. So this is really important in terms of when we look at the tier system that's been rolled out and whether or not there's a risk. So it's all about risk management. Whether there is an option to work remotely. So obviously many of us have been working remotely, but just because you have been working remotely doesn't necessarily mean that that is the best thing for the business, and nor is it something that could continue ongoingly for a long period of time. The subjective circumstances of the employee, including any general or specific risk of receiving a vaccination. So that might be there's a medical contravention, there may be some evidence there as to why they can't. That's a discussion that needs to be had. The ability of the vaccine to meet the reasons for the direction. So are they able to fulfill that obligation, and whether the reasons for the direction can reasonably be met by alternative means, such as physical distancing and wearing a face covering.
So in terms of the industries that are affected by public health orders, currently we've got quarantine workers, transportation workers, airport workers, residential aged care facilities, authorised workers leaving an area of concern, construction workers who live in an area of concern, and also early education, care facility workers and disability support workers who live in an area of concern, and certain healthcare workers and all employees at schools.
So when we look at tiers, it's really appropriate for you to understand which tier your business falls into. So a tier 1 is the employees required to work as part of their role with people with an increased risk of being infected with COVID. So that would be areas like border control, hotel quarantine, where there is more likely a risk. Tier 2 is employees required to have close contact with people who are vulnerable to health impacts. So that would be our healthcare or aged care. So they're more vulnerable people. You need to also think about if you have vulnerable people that are in your workplace. So if you do have older people in your workplace, are they more vulnerable, or do you have, very young people who are unable to be vaccinated? Things like that you need to consider. Tier 3 is interaction of likely between employees and other people, such as customers, other employees, or the public in the normal course of employment. So things like essential services, so retail, goods stores, anything like that, where you still have that close contact with people on a regular basis. And tier 4 is where employees have minimal face-to-face interaction as part of their role. So maybe before COVID, they worked from home and that was not an issue in terms of really having any face-to-face or community interaction because they were working from home anyway. So they would fall into a tier 4. So what we need to look at in tier 1 and tier 2, likely that a reasonable direction given would be upheld. So if you are a tier 1 or tier 2, then it is likely that it would be a reasonable and lawful direction to mandate vaccination. Tier 3, where there's no community transmissions for some time, and unfortunately at this point in time there are a lot of community transmissions, it's likely to be unreasonable if directed. So if there's not many community transmissions and it's unlikely that it would be lawful for you to mandate it. When the community transmission is occurring and the employer is able to remain open, a direction is likely to be more reasonable. So if there's lots of community transmissions, as there are at this point in time, then it is more likely to be reasonable to give a direction for vaccination.
Okay, so it depends on the public orders that apply. So if they have public health orders, like in childcare, for example, they can't be permitted to return to work until they've complied with the health orders. So, but that doesn't necessarily automatically mean termination of employment. There's a process that you need to follow. You then would look at having a lawful and reasonable direction to that employee, and look at and need to look at other work alternatives as well, and what other arrangements could possibly be made. Where, you know, do they go on leave without pay? Do you stand them down for a period of time? Do you look at changes of duties, reducing contact with clients if that's possible, moving the employee into a different section of the business where they don't have face-to-face contact with clients, if those things are possible. So it is a case-by-case basis when looking at mandating for employees, and it does also refer back to the different public health orders, and also looking back at the tiers that Karina's talked about. The tiers are really, I think, your first point of contact when you're looking at anything with regards to your employees. You need to, and they've been released by Fair Work. They're available on the Fair Work Commission website, so you can actually go back and look at those tiers. And you might have people in your business that are a tier 3 and some that are a tier 4. So your business might be a mix of two tiers. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach for all of your employees. It depends on their role, depends on their function, depends on their contact with other people within your business, outside of your business. I think you need to look at the tiers again. That's the first point of contact. Look at whether or not it's a lawful and reasonable direction to have them be vaccinated. And you also need to look at the risks within your business. What are the risks within your business for that person to return to work? Are there measures you can put in place to minimise the risk of that person? So, for example, they work in an area that's not client facing. They're maybe having to wear masks. There's potentially those things that you need to look at, and it does depend on the circumstances of your individual business. And I've spoken to multiple number of different businesses over the last few weeks, and every situation is different depending on the individual and their role and what they're doing. So as much as I'd love to be able to say this is what you need to do, it does vary based on the individual circumstances as to why they're not vaccinating, or, you know, the role they're in. So if they're in childcare, for example, I'll use that as an example because it is an area where they're mandated. It's probably more reasonable that you could direct them to be that they can't return to work, and that in an event they're not going to be able to fulfil the nature of their duties because they're not vaccinated. So it may lead to termination in that situation. In another example where it's a warehouse worker, it would be potentially a different result.
Typically, no, you can't refuse. However, there's always been a right that existed before COVID that an employee has a right to cease work if they have a reasonable concern that might expose them to a hazard. So if you know, you look at whether or not your business is well ventilated, there's social distancing, there's low cases of transmission, then generally the answer would be no. However, if you are a business that has thrown their hands up in the air and decided, I'm not going to have a COVID plan, I'm not going to have a policy, I'm just going to, you know, fly by the seat of my pants, then your employee probably has more of a right to say, well, until you put in place measures to protect me, then I consider it to be a hazard and therefore I won't be attending work. It's not so much in terms of whether they're vaccinated or not. It's more so how you're going to minimise the risk. And obviously, with the Delta strain, it is highly contagious. So you would have to think about things such as, you know, requiring those who potentially are unvaccinated to wear masks, to do certain things. Now, you have to consider, though, that the directions at the moment are that unless you're an essential worker, you won't be heading back to work unless you kind of are vaccinated. So the government has sort of taken away part of that. Yes, so the Therapeutic Goods Administration guidelines clearly states that you can encourage vaccination, but you cannot encourage a specific brand or provide health advice. So you can't say, well, you know, just go and get AZ or go and get AstraZeneca or go and get Pfizer or Moderna, whatever is available. You would just be encouraging them to get vaccination. But the biggest thing that I say to a lot of employers is just refer them back to their doctor and let them get the information about what is the correct vaccination for them.
Yes, so the Therapeutic Goods Association have said that you can reward your employees based on their vaccination status, but it needs to be retrospective as well. So if people have already had it in the past, so you can't sort of just do it for the ones that are doing it now. So if you do it, it needs to be retrospective, but yes, you can.
Yeah, so one of their biggest concerns was that if it's mandated and then you have a reaction to it, the federal government has developed a vaccine claims scheme. It's for those who suffer moderate to significant impact following an adverse reaction to the vaccine. The scheme is backdated to February 2021, and it covers the cost of any type of injuries, which would be the medical expenses or time off, I suspect, over $5,000. So there is a portal that already exists, and it hasn't yet been activated from what I understand, but you can lodge an intent to claim from the 6th of September 2021. I think we're waiting on some further guidelines from the government, but basically it's going to be taken out of your hands because people won't be allowed to move around unless they have a vaccination status passport. So if you're not, you won't be able to go into pubs and clubs, restaurants, cafes, retail, all of that, unless you are able to prove that you're fully vaccinated. A business can refuse entry to unvaccinated individuals. Between sort of 11th of October, which is the first sort of release date, to the 1st of December, only vaccinated people are allowed to move around. So it sort of makes it a little bit easier in terms of, well, you need to show me your vaccination before I'll allow you entry. If you're a business and you don't comply with the orders, my understanding it's a $5,000 fine. That's just for one breach, but they'll get you on other breaches if they can. And for the individual who breaches or does a false vaccination passport, it's $1,000 per breach. So if you're in a big venue, such as a pub or club or a restaurant, you're going to need someone to make sure they're adhering to the rules so you avoid having fines. It's really about reducing your exposure as a business, because if the police will be doing random spot checks, and if people aren't sitting down inside a venue or they don't have their vaccination pass and you can't prove that you checked it, then you'll be slapped with a fine. So the COVID marshalling, I haven't seen that it's been mandated, but I know from the last occasion, there were some industries where it was required under the COVID plan. So when you go and do your plan, if it's part of your industry, then you will have to provide one.
Okay, so in broad terms, indirect discrimination occurs when a person is required to comply with a general requirement or condition, such as mandatory COVID vaccinations, and they are unable to do so because of a protected attribute. So, for example, because of a disability or something else that's affected in this. That's in the broad term. So, but generally what I would be suggesting in terms of recommended response to those sorts of queries about its discrimination, I would be stating that you're following government mandate rules and you're required to provide this information as per the government requirements and the public health orders that are going to be released. So as a business, they as Corinne said, they announced last week that a business can be fined $5,000 if you breach the public health orders, and a breach of the public health orders would be letting people into your premises that are unvaccinated, if you're in a retail setting or a pub setting, for example. So you're following the public health orders and you're not discriminating against that person. And if that person is exempt, for example, from getting it, they would show you their exemption from being able to have the vaccination.
Well, it does to some degree, because at the moment you've been operating as takeaway, if you've been operating as takeaway only. So now you're moving back into being able to have patrons, depending upon the rules as to the square meters, how many people per square meters. And there's some really good guidelines on the government website around that for the different spaces. So 70% is different to 80%, and then 80% is different to come December. So you need to just make sure that you're adhering to those. What I think you need to do is make sure that you're complying with your COVID safety plan. What is the work health and safety components of it, and what is the workers' compensation exposure? So if you have been operating that business with you and another person and you're both vaccinated, that's fine. But if you're bringing in casuals or people returning back to work, are they vaccinated? What does that look like? The difference is that if a person is coming into your premises that is not just takeaway, because unvaccinated can still get takeaway and click and collect, then you need to make sure that they are providing you with evidence of their vaccination passport so that they can dine in and that you as a business are complying. So the New South Wales Health states that retail is only open to vaccinated and only essential services, as has been the case anyway, is for non-vaccinated. It doesn't specifically say around whether or not, unvaccinated people are allowed to work in retail, but you as a business, you have to make sure that you're providing a safe work environment. So if you you should already know, in my view, and if you don't, I recommend that you find out, because you can ask all of your employees whether they are vaccinated or not, to find out who is not, who is, and whether or not that exposes you to a risk. My advice to you would be that it does. You're exposing other employees within your business, but also you're exposing yourself to workers' compensation claims if they do contract it in your business. And they obviously are unvaccinated, then they've got a higher risk of, potentially getting very unwell, even result in death. That can result in a workers' compensation claim, which can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you don't really want to expose yourself. I don't think it's worth that type of risk. I would be going through and saying, well, what type of tier business am I? Is this person going to be exposed? Yes or no, and then make decisions about that. Yes, depending on who the owner or the manager is of the property, can decide whether or not you enter their site. That also goes for at home. So, for instance, if you're getting some services done at home, you can ask that person, are you vaccinated, and make informed decisions around whether or not you want to allow an unvaccinated person inside your premises, or whether or not you're not at home for a period of time while that person is there. You just need to be really mindful about risk and exposure. Technically, if they're able to prove that work was the main contributing factor and they contracted it in the workplace, then it will fall under workers' compensation. If it is contracted, you would just follow your normal work cover, or iCare it is now, I can show my age now, iCare, in terms of making sure that you lodge it within the 48 hours, give details of it, and then they will make the decision whether or not to accept or deny it, or to investigate it further.
Yes, they should do that. You need to ensure that you're following the workplace health and safety laws and managing your risk within your business. And you should also have a COVID safety plan in place as per the New South Wales government's requirements. You should also carry out toolbox talks with your staff or safety discussions to ensure that your employees are aware of the relevant PPE that they need to wear, social distancing, and that they're QR code checking in and meeting the requirements of all of the government that come and go as they change. We've had a lot of changes over the last 6 months, so you do need to make sure you've got a COVID risk assessment in place.